The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Victoria Sinclair adjusted her wedding veil for the 100th time. Her reflection stared back from the ornate mirror, showing a woman who looked every inch the perfect bride. The ivory silk dress hugged her curves flawlessly. The diamonds at her throat sparkled like captured starlight, but her green eyes held no joy. This wasn't a wedding born of love, it was a merger dressed in white lace and false promises. Outside the bridal suite, the St. Catherine's Cathedral buzzed with the city's elite. Politicians, business moguls, and socialites filled the pews, all witnesses to what the media called the wedding of the century. But Victoria knew the truth. She was about to marry a man she barely knew, a man whose touch she had never felt, whose heart remained as cold as the contracts they had both signed. Damien Cross stood at the altar, his tall frame impeccable in his custom-tailored black tuxedo. At 32, he commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His technology empire spanned continents, his decisions moved markets, and his piercing blue eyes missed nothing. Yet today, those eyes held the same expression he wore during board meetings, calculated and distant. Marriage was simply another business transaction, another strategic move in the grand chess game of corporate power. The organ music swelled as Victoria walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Every step felt like walking toward a beautiful prison. The Sinclair law firm needed Cross Industries' backing to survive the hostile takeover, threatening to destroy 3 generations of family legacy. Damien needed the Sinclair name and connections to expand into international markets. Love had never entered the equation. Their vows were recited with perfect precision, each word carefully chosen by their lawyers rather than their hearts. When Damien lifted her veil and kissed her, his lips were soft but emotionless, a performance for the cameras that would splash their union across tomorrow's headlines. Victoria closed her eyes and pretended she felt something, anything, beyond the hollow ache in her chest. The reception at the Cross estate was a spectacle of wealth and power. Victoria smiled for photographs, danced with strangers, and played the role of the blissful bride while her new husband conducted business in the corner, his attention already shifting to profit margins and quarterly reports. They were married, but they remained strangers, sharing nothing more than a legal document and matching rings. Their honeymoon was canceled for urgent business matters. Instead, they returned to Damien's penthouse, a glass tower that scraped the clouds and felt as cold as winter mornings. The apartment was a monument to success, all sharp angles and expensive art, lacking any warmth or personal touch. 2 master bedrooms sat at opposite ends of the sprawling space, a physical reminder of the emotional distance between them. Weeks passed in polite indifference. Victoria threw herself into her law practice, winning cases that had once seemed impossible, proving she was more than just a pretty face in a profitable marriage. Damien buried himself in acquisitions and expansions, his empire growing while his capacity for human connection remained frozen. They shared meals in silence, attended social functions as the perfect couple, and lived completely separate lives under the same roof. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for the storm that changed everything. October arrived with unusual fury, bringing with it the kind of weather that reminded humans how small they truly were. Victoria had been working late at the firm when the emergency broadcasts began. A massive storm system was bearing down on the city, bringing hurricane-force winds and the kind of rainfall that turned streets into rivers. Damien called her phone just as she was preparing to leave the office. His voice was crisp and businesslike as always, but there was an edge of concern that surprised her. "The roads are too dangerous," he said. "I'm sending a car to bring you to the estate. We'll wait it out there." The estate was Damien's private retreat, a sprawling mansion nestled in the hills outside the city. Victoria had seen it only in photographs, a place where he conducted his most sensitive business dealings away from prying eyes. The drive through the storm was harrowing, the car fighting against winds that bent trees like flowers and rain that turned the world into a watercolor painting. The mansion rose from the darkness like something from a Gothic novel, all stone. and shadow with tall windows that glowed warm against the storm. Inside, it was surprisingly intimate compared to the sterile penthouse. Rich woods, leather-bound books, and fireplaces that actually held real fires created an atmosphere that felt almost romantic if one were inclined toward such foolish notions. The power went out just after midnight, plunging them into a world of candles and flickering firelight. The generator would keep essential systems running, but the normal barriers of technology and artificial light were stripped away, leaving them more alone together than they had ever been. Victoria sat in the library wrapped in a cashmere throw, trying to lose herself in a novel while the storm raged outside. Damien appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of wine, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed, his tie loosened for once. He looked almost human in the warm light, almost approachable. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her a glass. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, sending an unexpected spark up her arm. In all their months of marriage, they had barely touched beyond the necessities of public appearances. "Thank you," she murmured, surprised by the husky quality of her own voice. The wine was excellent, warming her from the inside as the fire warmed her skin. Damien settled into the chair across from her, and for the first time since their wedding, they simply looked at each other without pretense or agenda. "I never asked what you were reading," he said, nodding toward the book in her lap. It was such a normal question, the kind couples asked each other every day, but between them it felt revolutionary. "Poetry," she admitted, feeling foolish. "Byron. I know it's old-fashioned, but sometimes the old words capture feelings better than new ones." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the ice that had encased him for so long. "Read me something," he said quietly. Victoria's heart skipped as she flipped through the pages, finding one of her favorites. Her voice was soft in the candle-lit room as she read about love and longing, about the passion that could consume souls and remake worlds. When she finished, silence fell between them, heavy with possibility. "Beautiful," Damien said, and she wasn't sure if he meant the poetry or something else entirely. He moved to the couch beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Victoria, Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the windows and cutting off his words. In the sudden flash of lightning, she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Vulnerability, want, need. Maybe it was the wine, or the storm, or the way the firelight painted everything in shades of gold and shadow. Maybe it was months of loneliness and pretending not to care, but when he reached for her, she didn't pull away. When his lips found hers, she kissed him back with a desperation that surprised them both. His hands tangled in her hair as the kiss deepened. Months of careful politeness dissolving into something primal and honest. She had never been touched with such reverence, as if she were something precious rather than convenient. Her dress whispered to the floor, followed by his shirt, his hands mapping her skin like he was memorizing every curve and hollow. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her throat, and the gentleness in his voice nearly undid her completely. "Yes," she breathed, pulling him closer. "Please." What happened next was unlike anything she had ever imagined. He worshipped her body, with his hands and mouth, taking his time despite the passion burning between them. When she cried out his name, it wasn't duty or obligation, but pure, overwhelming pleasure. When he moved inside her, she felt the barrier of her innocence give way, saw his eyes widen in shock and something deeper. "Victoria," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. Why didn't you tell me?" But words seemed inadequate in that moment. Instead, she showed him with her body, with the way she moved beneath him, with the tears of joy that slipped down her cheeks as he made love to her, with a tenderness that broke her heart and healed it simultaneously. Afterward, they lay entwined before the dying fire, her head on his chest, his fingers stroking her hair. For the first time since their wedding, the silence between them felt peaceful rather than painful. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but inside, Something entirely new was just beginning. "What happens now?" she whispered into the darkness. His arms tightened around her. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never felt anything like this before." Neither had she, but she was too afraid to say so. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for one night, that fairy tales could come true and that contracts written on paper could be rewritten by hearts. When morning came, everything changed. Victoria woke alone, the fireplace cold, her clothes neatly folded on a chair. Damien was gone, and with him, any trace of the tender man who had held her through the night. By the time she dressed and found him in his study, the familiar ice had returned to his eyes. "Good morning," he said without looking up from his laptop. "I've arranged for a car to take you back to the city. I have meetings all day." Just like that, the magic was over. The storm had passed, and with it, any hope that one perfect night could change the fundamental truth of what they were to each other. A business arrangement, a convenient marriage, nothing more. Victoria lifted her chin and walked away with her dignity intact, but her heart shattered into pieces as small as the raindrops still clinging to the windows. She had given him everything, shown him her most vulnerable self, and he had dismissed it all as easily as he would a failed investment. The ride back to the city was endless, each mile taking her further from the woman she had been in his arms, and back to the careful stranger she would have to remain. But something had changed inside her, something he couldn't take back no matter how cold his morning after treatment had been. She was no longer the virgin bride who had married him for duty. She was a woman who had tasted passion and found it both wonderful and terrible. And though she didn't know it yet, she was carrying a secret that would soon make their careful distance impossible to maintain. The billionaire had touched her body for one night, but she had touched something deeper in him. Whether he admitted it or not, Damien Cross was no longer the same man who calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. Some things, Victoria was about to learn, were worth more than money, and some mistakes changed everything forever. 3 weeks after the storm, Victoria stood in her bathroom staring at the plastic test in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. Positive, pregnant. The word echoed in her mind like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the marble floor, the cold seeping through her silk nightgown as reality crashed over her in waves. She was carrying Damien Cross's child, the same man who had made love to her with such tenderness one night, then treated her like a stranger the next morning. The same man who had returned to his ice-cold demeanor, conducting their marriage like a board meeting, speaking only when necessary, and never about anything that mattered. The nausea that had been plaguing her for days suddenly made perfect sense. The exhaustion that no amount of coffee could cure, the way certain smells made her stomach lurch, the emotional sensitivity that had her crying at television commercials. Her body had been trying to tell her what her mind refused to accept. Victoria pulled herself up from the floor and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her green eyes wide with shock, but underneath the fear, something else was growing, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This child, unplanned and unwanted by its father, was already precious to her in a way that defied logic. She dressed carefully for work that morning, choosing a navy suit that gave her confidence and hid the slight bloating she now understood. At the law firm, she threw herself into her cases with renewed determination, as if winning legal battles could somehow prepare her for the personal war she was about to fight. James Whitmore knocked on her office door just before lunch, his kind, face creased with concern. He had been her partner at the firm for 2 years, and his unrequited feelings for her were an open secret everyone pretended not to notice. "You look tired, Victoria. Everything all right at home?" Home. The word was laughable when applied to the sterile penthouse where she and Damien lived like polite roommates. "Just busy," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "The Morrison case is more complex than we anticipated." James studied her with the intensity that made him such a good lawyer. "If you ever need to talk about anything, Anything at all, you know. I'm here for you. His kindness made her throat tight with unshed tears. Here was a man who genuinely cared about her, who would probably be thrilled to learn she was pregnant, who would want to build a real family with her. But her heart, traitorous thing that it was, still belonged to the cold billionaire who had shown her paradise for one night, then locked the gates forever. That evening, Victoria sat in the penthouse living room, watching the city lights twinkle, below like fallen stars. Damien was late as usual, probably closing another multi-million-dollar deal or acquiring another company to add to his empire. When he finally arrived, he barely glanced in her direction. "Good evening," he said, loosening his tie as he headed toward his study. The same polite greeting he would give a hotel concierge. "Damien, wait." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "We need to talk." He paused, his hand on the doorframe, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope? Fear? But when he turned to face her, his expression was as neutral as always. "Is there a legal matter that requires my attention?" The clinical way he spoke to her, as if she were just another business associate, made her stomach clench. "Not legal. Personal." I wasn't aware we had personal matters to discuss. His dismissal cut deep, but Victoria forced herself to stand and face him. "We do now. I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Damien's face went through a series of micro-expressions so quickly she almost missed them. Shock, then something that might have been joy, followed immediately by the familiar mask of indifference sliding back into place. "I see," he said, as if she had just informed him of a change in the weather. "How far along?" "About 3 weeks." Since that night, she didn't need to add. They both knew when it had happened. Damien moved to the bar and poured himself a scotch with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "I assume you want to discuss our options." Options. As if their child was a problem to be solved, a complication to be managed. Victoria felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "There's only one option as far as I'm concerned. I'm having this baby." "That's not what I meant." He took a sip of his drink, studying her over the rim of the glass. "I meant our options going forward. Custody arrangements, financial support, how we handle the media attention." "You mean how we handle the scandal of the great Damien Cross having an actual heir?" "Don't be dramatic, Victoria. A child changes things. We need to approach this strategically." Strategically. Of course, because even their unborn baby was just another business transaction to him. Victoria felt the last of her foolish hopes crumble to dust. "You want to know what I think our strategy should be?" "Divorce. I'll raise this child alone." For the first time since she had known him, Damien looked genuinely surprised. "That's not necessary. We can make this work within our current arrangement." "What arrangement? You mean our fake marriage where we live like strangers and pretend to tolerate each other for the cameras?" Victoria's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I won't raise a child in this emotional wasteland you call a life. You're being unreasonable. Think about what you're giving up. The financial security, the social position, the opportunities I can provide for our child. What? About love, Damien? What about actually caring whether your child is happy or just successful?" She moved closer to him, desperate to reach some human part of him that might still exist. "What about the man who held me that night and made me feel like I mattered?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had gotten through to him. Then his walls went up again, higher than ever. That was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by unusual circumstances. It won't happen again. The casual way he dismissed the most beautiful night of her life felt like a physical blow. Victoria stepped back, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "Fine. Then we have nothing more to discuss. I'll have my lawyer draw up the divorce papers." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the doorway. "Victoria." "What?" I won't make this difficult for you. You'll have everything you need, more than enough to raise our child comfortably. Our child. Not my child or the child, but ours. It was the first time he had acknowledged any emotional connection to the baby growing inside her, and it made her heartache with what might have been. I don't want your money, Damien. I want a father for this baby, not a financial benefactor. Since you've made it clear that's impossible, we're done here. Over the following weeks, Victoria threw herself into preparing for single motherhood with the same determination she brought to her legal cases. She researched obstetricians, toured daycare centers, and began looking for a smaller apartment where she could build a real home for herself and her child. The divorce papers arrived at Damien's office on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier, who seemed nervous to be in the presence of such wealth and power. His assistant, a efficient woman named Patricia, who had worked for him for 8 years, brought them to his attention with unusual hesitation. Sir, Mrs. Cross's attorney sent these over. They require your signature. Damien stared at the manila envelope as if it contained a bomb. Inside were the legal documents that would dissolve his marriage and free Victoria from their arrangement. Everything was fair, reasonable, and devastatingly final. She asked for nothing beyond her personal belongings and the right to raise their child without interference from him. For the first time in his adult life, Damien Cross felt completely out of control. His business empire continued to grow, his net worth increased daily, and his influence expanded across continents. But the one thing that suddenly mattered most was slipping away from him, and all his money and power were useless to stop it. He found himself driving to her law firm that evening, though he couldn't have said why. The building was mostly empty, but light still glowed from her corner office. Through the glass walls, he could see her bent over case files, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. She looked tired but determined, beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. Victoria sensed his presence before she looked up. Some part of her would always be attuned to him, no matter how badly he had hurt her. When their eyes met through the glass, she felt the familiar jolt of electricity that time and pain hadn't been able to diminish. She buzzed him in without speaking, then returned to her files as if his presence meant nothing to her. Damien entered her office and closed the door behind him, noting the subtle changes that pregnancy had already brought to her body. A slight fullness to her face, a new softness that made her even more beautiful. "Have you come to sign the papers?" she asked without looking up. "No." The word came out rougher than he intended. "I came to ask you to reconsider." "Reconsider what? Divorcing you? Raising our child in a home filled with love instead of legal contracts?" Victoria finally looked at him, and he was shocked by the pain in her green eyes. "Give me one good reason why I should stay married to a man who treats me like a business obligation." Damien opened his mouth to give her logical reasons: financial security, social stability, practical considerations that made sense on paper. But standing there in her office, looking at the woman who carried his child and still managed to be stronger than he had ever been, only one truth emerged. "Because I love you." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread forever. Victoria's breath caught, her hand freezing over the document she had been reviewing. For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes like a candle in the wind. Then reality crashed back in. "No, you don't. You love control. You love winning. You love the idea of having the perfect wife to complete your perfect image. But you don't love me, Damien. If you did, you wouldn't have spent the last 3 weeks treating me like I was invisible. I was scared." The admission cost him everything, stripping away years of carefully constructed armor. "That night during the storm, I felt things I've never felt before. You made me vulnerable in a way that terrified me. So I did what I always do when something threatens my control. I retreated." Victoria stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "And what's different now? What's changed?" "You're leaving me." His voice broke slightly on the words. "I'm losing you and our child, and for the first time in my life, I care more about something than I do about protecting myself." She wanted to believe him. Every cell in her body yearned to cross the room and fall into his arms to give him another chance to break her heart. But she had to think about more than herself now. She had a baby to protect, a child who deserved, better than parents who couldn't trust each other. It's too late, Damien. I can't keep hoping you'll change, can't keep waiting for you to decide I'm worth the risk. Our baby deserves parents who can love without fear, and you've made it clear that's not something you're capable of. She moved toward the door, intending to ask him to leave. But Damien stepped into her path, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the desperation in his blue eyes. Then teach me, he said quietly. Show me how to love without fear. Give me a chance to be the man you saw in me that night, the man I want to be for you and our child. For a moment, Victoria wavered. Then she remembered the coldness in his eyes the morning after, the weeks of indifference, the clinical way. He had discussed their options when she told him about the pregnancy. I'm sorry, she whispered, stepping around him toward the door. But I can't risk it. Not for me and not for our baby. She left him standing alone in her office, surrounded by the legal documents that would end their marriage and the shattered pieces of the only love he had ever known. Outside, Victoria sat in her car for a long time, tears streaming down her face as she felt their child flutter inside her like a butterfly made of hope and sorrow. The papers would be signed. The divorce would be final. And Damien Cross would learn that some things, once lost, could never be bought back. 6 months had passed since Victoria signed the divorce papers, and her life had taken on a rhythm she never could have imagined. Her small apartment overlooking the park was filled with baby furniture, soft blankets, and the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy. At 7 months pregnant, she glowed with a contentment that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. James Whitmore had become a constant presence in her life, helping her assemble cribs, driving her to doctor's appointments, and treating her unborn child as if it were his own. His devotion was genuine and unwavering, the kind of steady love that promised safety and security. Victoria tried to feel grateful for his attention, tried to convince herself that this was what real love looked like. But her heart remained, stubbornly attached to a man who had proven himself incapable of loving her back. Damien had honored his word about not making the divorce difficult. The papers had been signed quickly and quietly, with generous financial arrangements that Victoria had reluctantly accepted for the sake of their child. He had made no attempt to contact her, no efforts to see her, no acknowledgement that she was carrying his baby. The tabloids had speculated wildly about their sudden separation, but neither party had offered any public statements. What Victoria didn't know was that Damien was slowly falling apart. The great Damien Cross, master of the universe, had discovered that there were some losses that no amount of success could compensate for. His business empire continued to grow, but every achievement felt hollow. He closed million-dollar deals with the same enthusiasm he might feel for ordering coffee. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a mausoleum filled with memories of the woman who had briefly brought it to life. He had started sending flowers to her apartment, beautiful arrangements that arrived weekly without cards or messages. Victoria always threw them away immediately, but not before breathing in their fragrance and remembering the night when everything had been perfect between them. She never acknowledged receiving them, but she never asked for them to stop either. Then came the morning when everything changed again. Victoria was reviewing case files at her kitchen table, a cup of herbal tea growing cold beside her, when the contractions started. At first, she dismissed them as the false labor pains her doctor had warned her about. But as they grew stronger and more regular, she realized this was the real thing. 2 weeks early, but real nonetheless. Her hands shook as she called for a taxi, then James, then her doctor. But as another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, she found herself dialing a number she had memorized but never called. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. Damien. Her voice came out as a whisper. The baby's coming. Silence stretched between them for a heartbeat. Then, I'm on my way. The line went dead, and Victoria was left clutching her phone, wondering what impulse had made her call him. Pride told her to call James back, to let him be the one to drive her to the hospital and hold her hand through labor. But something deeper, something she had been trying to ignore for months, wanted Damien there when their child entered the world. He arrived at her apartment in record time, his hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he had run the entire way. When she opened the door, leaning heavily against the frame as another contraction peaked, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Pure, undiluted terror. "Is this really happening?" he asked, his usual composure completely shattered. "Unless you know how to make it stop," Victoria gasped, then surprised them both by laughing. The absurdity of the situation, the way he looked like he might faint, the fact that she was having a baby whether she was ready or not, struck her as suddenly hilarious. Damien stepped forward instinctively, his hands hovering near her shoulders, without quite touching. "What do you need? What can I do?" "Help me to the car," she said, then groaned as another wave of pain washed over her. "And maybe try not to look like you're about to throw up. One of us should stay calm." The ride to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights, rushed conversations, with the medical team, and Damien's hand wrapped around hers so tightly she thought he might cut off her circulation. But she didn't pull away. In that moment, facing the unknown together, all their history fell away, and they were simply two people about to become parents. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Victoria's obstetrician, met them at the hospital entrance with a wheelchair and a calm smile that immediately reassured them both. "Right on time," she said cheerfully, as if babies being born 2 weeks early was perfectly normal. "Let's get you settled and see how things are progressing." The next few hours passed in a haze of increasing intensity. Victoria had read every book about childbirth, attended every class, thought she knew what to expect, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming reality of bringing a life into the world. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, waves of sensation that demanded every ounce of her strength and focus. Damien stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand when she needed something to grip, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering words of encouragement that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him she hadn't known existed. When she screamed during the worst contractions, he looked like he was in physical pain himself, as if he could take her, suffering into his own body if only he knew how. "I can't do this," Victoria gasped during a brief respite between contractions. "It's too much. I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are." Damien's voice was firm, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that cut through her panic. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. You left me when it would have been easier to stay. You chose to do this alone, rather than accept a marriage without love. If you can do that, you can do anything." His words gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. When the final stage of labor arrived, when Dr. Martinez told her to push, Victoria drew on reserves of power that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Damien coached her through each push, his voice steady and sure, his presence anchoring her to something solid in the chaos of bringing forth life. And then suddenly, it was over. A cry filled the room, strong and indignant, announcing the arrival of their daughter. Dr. Martinez placed the baby on Victoria's chest, and time seemed to stop as they both stared down at the tiny, perfect human being they had created together. She was beautiful in the way that all newborns are beautiful, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Dark hair like her mother's, but with her father's strong jaw and what would probably become his piercing blue eyes. She stopped crying the moment she felt her mother's skin, as if she knew she was finally home. "She's perfect," Damien whispered, his voice thick with emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. Tears streamed down his face unashamed as he reached out with one finger to touch his daughter's tiny hand. She grasped it immediately, her fingers so small they could barely wrap around his, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Hello, little one," Victoria murmured, exhausted but radiant with joy. "We've been waiting for you." In that moment, watching his wife and daughter together, Damien felt something inside him break open completely. All the walls he had built, all the armor he had worn, all the careful control he had maintained over his emotions, crumbled to dust. This was what mattered. This was what he had been searching for without even knowing it. Not success or power or wealth, but this. Love, family, connection. What should we call her? He asked softly. Victoria looked up at him, and for the first time in months, there was no anger in her eyes, only wonder and something that might have been hope. I was thinking, Emma, it means whole or universal. She's made us both whole. Again, hasn't she? Emma, Damien repeated, testing the name. Emma Cross. He paused, then looked at Victoria with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. If you'll let her keep my name. If you'll let me be her father, not just biologically, but really be her father. She's your daughter, Damien. Nothing will ever change that. And you? The question hung between them, loaded with months of pain and misunderstanding. Is there any chance you could ever forgive me? That we could try again? Do it right this time? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. She saw the man who had hurt her, yes, but she also saw the man who had just cried at the sight of his daughter, who had held her hand through the hardest thing she had ever done, who looked at their baby like she was the most precious thing in the world. I don't know, she said honestly. You hurt me, Damien. You made me feel like what we shared meant nothing to you. It meant everything to me. That's why I was so scared. He moved closer, his hand still entwined with their daughter's tiny fingers. I've spent my whole life believing that caring about someone gave them the power to destroy you. My father taught me that love was weakness, that emotions were liabilities. But losing you taught me something else. Not loving someone you care about. That's the real destruction. Emma made a small sound, as if she was listening to their conversation and had opinions about it. Both parents looked down at her, and Victoria felt her heart soften despite her determination to stay guarded. She's going to need both of us, Victoria said quietly. Not living in separate houses, not sharing custody on weekends, but really both of us. Can you be that kind of father? The kind who puts his family before his business, who shows up for school plays and bedtime stories and all the ordinary moments? That matter more than board meetings? I want to learn how. I want you to teach me. Damien's voice was steady, but his eyes held a vulnerability that was completely new. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway, not because I think I can convince you with logic or buy you back with expensive gifts, but because I love you. I love you and Emma more than I've ever loved anything, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision. In her arms, Emma stirred restlessly, as if sensing the tension in the room. When Victoria opened her eyes again, she found Damien watching her with an expression of barely contained hope. One chance, she said finally. One real chance to build something together. Not a contract marriage, not a convenient arrangement, but a real partnership based on love and trust and putting our family first. If you can do that, if you can really change, then maybe we can find our way back to each other. Damien's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I won't waste it, he promised. I'll spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret giving me this chance. He leaned down carefully, mindful of Victoria's exhaustion and the baby in her arms, and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. It wasn't passionate or demanding, just gentle and full of promise, a beginning rather than a continuation. Over the following months, Damien proved that he meant every word. He scaled back his business commitments, delegating responsibilities he had never trusted to anyone else. He moved into Victoria's small apartment, claiming he preferred it to his sterile penthouse because it felt like a real home. He learned to change diapers at 3 in the morning, to soothe Emma's cries with gentle songs, to find joy in the ordinary moments that made up a life. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were nights when Victoria woke to find Damien, standing over Emma's crib, simply watching their daughter sleep with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. There were moments when his old instincts kicked in, when he tried to solve problems with money rather than presence. But he was learning. They both were. 6 months after Emma's birth, Damien surprised Victoria with a proposal that had nothing to do with business mergers or family obligations. He got down on one knee in their living room while Emma played on a blanket nearby and asked her to marry him again. Not because their lawyers recommended it or their families expected it, but because he wanted to spend the rest of his life loving her and their daughter. This time, he said, holding out a simple band of gold that bore no resemblance to the elaborate diamond he had given her before, "It's just for us. No contracts, no conditions, no merger of empires. Just love." Victoria said yes, with tears in, her eyes and Emma babbling her approval from the floor. Their second wedding was nothing like their first. No cathedral full of strangers, no media coverage, no elaborate reception, just family and close friends gathered in the park where Victoria had walked during her pregnancy, where she had dreamed of raising her daughter surrounded by love. James Whitmore walked her down the aisle this time, his face peaceful despite the broken heart she knew he carried. He had become a true friend, someone who loved her enough to want her happiness even when it didn't include him. When Damien lifted her veil this time, his kiss held all the passion and tenderness that had been missing from their first wedding. When they exchanged vows, the words came from their hearts rather than a lawyer's script. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, Emma clapped her tiny hands from her position in the front row as if she knew her parents had finally found their way to where they belonged. The billionaire who had once believed love was a weakness had learned that it was actually the greatest strength of all. And the woman who had given up on fairy tales discovered that sometimes they came true in the most unexpected ways. As they danced to their first song as a real married couple, Emma, sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms nearby, Victoria looked up at her husband with eyes full of wonder. "No regrets?" she asked softly. Damien tightened his arms around her, thinking of the contract marriage that had brought them together, the night that had changed everything, the months of pain that had led them here. "Not a single one," he said. "Every mistake, every moment of fear, every day we spent apart led us to this. To Emma, to each other, to the life we're going to build together." "I love you," Victoria whispered against his chest. "I love you too," he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Both of you, forever." In the end, the one-night stand that had changed the billionaire forever hadn't been about passion or desire or even the unexpected pregnancy that resulted from it. It had been about learning that some things were worth more than money, more valuable than power, more important than protecting yourself from pain. Love was worth the risk. Family was worth the sacrifice. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a contract written in desperation could become a love story written in hope. Damien Cross had everything he had ever thought he wanted, but it was only when he learned to love without fear that he discovered what he had actually needed all along. A home filled with laughter, a wife who challenged him to be better, and a daughter who reminded him every day that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold. They could only be given freely, with an open heart and a willingness to risk everything for love.